This is Quantified Software. Welcome, Steve. We're glad to have you today. Quantified Software is for builders, managers, executives, founders, investors, and we're searching for a better way to build software. Not just in the details of the tools, but how do we up-level it? How do we conceptualize the timeless patterns, the conceptions that will help us understand what to build? Are we building it the right way? Did we build the right thing? How do we know what the work in progress is? How do you manage a team? And how do you quantify all these things? So with me today is my co-host Cam, and he'll be introducing our guest.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Miles. So with us today is Steve Robinson. Steve has been at the start, been at ideation phase of software projects through acquisition, patents, has started several different independent projects, has started a IT consulting company and recruiting company, and formed teams for larger companies and gone inside enterprise software and built things out. Has many passion projects, side projects, always seems to be introducing some other software project and hardware hack that he has come up with. So I'm always very impressed with what Steve has done, what he's doing. I think he has a great perspective on software, so we're glad we could bring him to you today. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much, and I'm very excited to be, on the show, the video, and having a chance to talk through many of the challenges that I faced, because I think as somebody who's a practitioner in engineering and somebody who loves building things, you pick up a wealth of knowledge, which you really want to hand on to other people to help them out. So I'm very excited to be here to have a chance to chat through some of those topics.
Great, yeah, so just to set the stage a little bit, could you give us a little bit of the context of what sort of scale projects, what sort of scale software your experience is in?
Many of the projects that I've worked on have started off with somebody with an idea. And that person often is what you might call a domain expert. They know a lot about their subject, but they don't really know about how to translate that into technology. And that doesn't just mean picking a programming language, but there's many aspects that you need to consider as you're trying to take the arc, this trajectory from having an idea to making it something of value to other people, which is really kind of what we do. And then through to scaling those ideas out and starting to think about the next level, which is how to build a team around that. How do you find those people? How do you get the correct set of incentives so that they can be really excited in the same way that you're excited about it to help build that out?
Okay, yeah, and since we're quantified software, could we get some numbers? I heard some numbers there at the end. So lower bound of 0 engineers as a starting team size with
That's
idea,
right.
Working with entrepreneurs or founders. But as those team sizes kind of ramp up, what's your experience been as far as
my experience is sort of taking like from the 0 engineer. Well, if I'm involved, it always starts off with 1, right? And then it heads up, and typically kind of about the kind of 5-6 engineer team, adding in designers and so forth.
You take the founder or the entrepreneur from the domain expert, from this idea that they have, and you help refine with them. But then you start building, and you're 2 weeks in or you're 4 weeks in, and you're kind of in the middle there. How do you track your progress? How do you track that you are actually on trajectory towards building the thing that you thought you were there to build?
One might think initially, hey, I'm just going to write. I mean, the obvious thing is I'm just going to write out what it is that I want. And then I'm going to basically send that off around the back of the, around the other side will come the product, right? There's a lot of problems with that. And obviously it's agile, that's a waterfall process. But what we're talking about is something like agile development, whereby you have quick iterations and you're trying to map onto what it is that you're trying to build, right?
Can we quantify quick though? So quick has a different meaning to different people. Could you give us some units of time here of
yeah, I mean, I think, 2 weeks seems to be a reasonable time in which you can get something done, but you can also have quick feedback from the client about what it is they do and they don't like.
Okay, so let's talk about that 2 week cycle time of getting feedback. Have you seen projects on either side of that, of going on trying to do 1 week cycle time? And what are the kind of the pathologies you see or the problems you see there? Advantages maybe as well. And then also lengthening, as you change from that optimal point, as you describe it, how do you see the project changing? What are the things you notice that change?
Well, number one is an optimal point of that needle, your set point, your desired point changes as the project changes, right? And I think you have to come at a process. I mean, in a sense, stepping back, if you're trying to be quantified about this, you might say, what is the framework in which I can then use to then build great software? I will bring this framework, I will operate under its principles. I just have to learn that. And then I will be optimal in my trajectory of what I do, right? And working out whether it's 2 weeks, 1 week, 4 weeks is part of tuning into one of those properties.
Right.
I think one has to be a little careful that frameworks don't deal with all of the situations that you find as you get into a project, right? And you have to be, like an army, you have lots of plans, but first contact with the enemy, you may have to throw some of those away. Not all of it, but some of it. I think with those initial cycles with a client, it may be that you've got daily cycles, right? You're just doing something and you say, let's regroup this afternoon, right? And let's do this. Let's have 2-day cycles, right? We're going to, maybe the design of the UI. Maybe you want to start off with saying, well, what's the UI? We've broadly mapped it out, some wireframes. Let's just dig in the next level. And you start hitting a bunch of gnarly questions about, well, if they log in here, but they have already got that token, which is the coupon, how are they going to then, all that kind of stuff. You'll start to see them as you start to build that UI. And that might be something where you really have a loop that's a day or 2 days, right? Then you start to say, okay, we're going from this initial kind of UI to actually building chunks of it, right? And, then it may be that you say, give me a week, right? I need to do this thing. It will take a week. And then you work for that cycle. And then you come back at the end of that week. It may be that you find that there's certain things that have got a lot out of hand, quote unquote, in terms of the technical complexity that's been unearthed as you've discovered this. And you say, that feature now, if I plotted, benefit to cost, it's the benefit is still where it is, but the cost has just moved it into a different place. We should focus on a new feature now. Okay. So I think it's as you get bigger and bigger, it can be that you lengthen those cycles, but I think you probably want to maintain a certain amount of like 2 weeks of like an upper cap around which you would then iterate.
So you're talking about cycle time when you're in a more uncertain domain and you're more in the search mode. You want to dial up cycle time so that it's going much faster and you're getting feedback faster. And that you're saying dial it back, and you're saying 2 weeks is sort of the slowest you would want to get feedback on a software project.
Yeah, because
the other thing I think I heard you say was that you measure progress by like delivered features, by actually being able to demo the features to the customer. That is the way you know that you're on track, that you're building.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be that feature is something that you could do in a day. So don't wait another, week and a bit to chat with. Don't then build 3 other features that you think they might like around it. Just check in with them. Because it might be that first feature, when presented to those people that are users, they say, that's great, that's really good. But we'd really be a whiz-bang feature if we added these extra little twiddles to it. Or they might say, yeah, that's good, but that's a good feature, but what I really want is, and you need to be available to hear that what I really want from those users, which gives you a little bit of needle on what might be something that has a lot of value for them, which might not be what you first think it is.
Yeah, I was once in a meeting with an engineer who was complaining about internal customer feedback at the end of a build cycle and wanted to say that this is not the time for requirements. And I think what you're pointing out is being available to hear, even if it's as criticism of what you just built, that's really requirements for the next cycle.
Absolutely. And I think we're human, right? We have emotional responses to the world. And a lot of frameworks try and teach us that we should like not lean on those two heavily. And I think part of when you've spent a week of your hardest work building a great feature, and a client says, well, that setup sucks, right? You kind of initially said, no, it doesn't. You know, your initial feelings are like, whoa, that's like, but you know, if that's important to have that feeling, you shouldn't be a robot. That's telling you some information about the thing you did. But that delta in which they're saying, here is new information, can easily be drowned out by an emotional response. And you say, no, it's not, you know, we shouldn't do that. We should, you know, we keep doing what we're doing is the right thing. It's the good way of doing it, right? Which it may be completely not, right? And I think this is my worry about framework. And yeah, so backing up, that delta is insight, right? That delta of what they've told you versus what you have could be the most valuable goal that whole 2 weeks was achieving. But you shouldn't then go back to the developer and say, oh, that whatever you did for 2 weeks is a complete waste of time. You should never have done it. If you hadn't made that journey, you wouldn't have been able to see that thing.
Yeah, I like that you had to do the work to then learn that the work was unnecessary.
Yeah, it told you something. It told you something. And if you you know, it told you that there is a cliff and you could keep walking.
you could have kept walking, but you're going to stop. So, but let's take the case where you deliver something, and let's say the client likes it from you know, or that it's acceptable for the use case. Along the way, you know, you've delivered a thing, but how do you know what the quality of that thing is? How do you quantify the feature that you shipped? Is it going to work going into the future, or are people going to be able to come behind and maintain it? We hear all these terms about unmaintainable or technical debt. Like, how do you conceive of that as you're doing this first delivery to the customer?
I think the initial human thought is, I delivered this thing. Was it good quality or was it bad quality? And then you say, well, there's sort of an absolute scale of like, this is spaghetti code, it's bad quality. And this is something which has plastered with unit tests and documentation. And that's really good. That's the gold standard. But that's false, right? Really, each of those aspects of non-functional features of maintainability, testing, and so forth, they're features. They're just like any other features. And it may be that you wanted to invest in that aspect now, or maybe you couldn't afford to invest in that aspect now, and you should delay investing in that aspect till later, which is why I like the term technical debt. It encompasses this concept that having debt can be very valuable. It's in a sense, if you say, I have a client we found this person, they could potentially open us up to a big client base. We need to show them something, right? And if a developer says, oh, it needs to be fully unit tested and it done the right way, you know, but that person has gone, then that was a terrible choice. That was obviously a bad choice. If you got the thing working with hokey HTML, elastic bands, and all sorts of nasty jQuery and spaghetti code with mozzarella balls and all sorts of terrible things in there, but it got that person to see a vision and got them bought in, that was exactly the right quality for that project. So I think you have to be careful. I'm not apologizing for bad code. I'm just saying you should be mindful, big-brained about this, to say, when should I be doing what? And that kind of gets me to a point of saying, with software development, it's like an onion of judgments, right? Whether to pick we're going to make it just smoke and mirrors, or whether we should pick now's the time to implement all the unit tests is a judgment call, right? And with software development, it's judgments within judgments, you know, in many, many layers, right? So I think when you're engaging with a software team or a partner, that's kind of some of the things you should be really thinking about. Not just, is this person know React? Because we need it built in React because I heard React's what people build things in, you know? And it should be like, is this person kind of got, which is what you would call experience, right? Versus, capability or horsepower, and the horsepower judgments is going to be a big piece of that.
So in this onion model that you're talking about of judgments inside of judgments, and you have a whole team, and you have some belief about where your trade-off in this multi-dimensional space between quality and delivering sooner and getting suitability for the purpose, right? So how do you communicate to the rest of the team what those trade-offs should be, or where you find that your project or where this project exists in that space such that they are making in the instantaneous decisions, the hundreds of decisions they're making at the keyboard, the same sort of trade-offs that you would want them to make as far as how to steer the project in the same way that you would if you were sitting coding, but you have a team of 6, so you can't be sitting at each keyboard.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of talks to, if you, let's say, pick a number, right? Let's say you've got 2,000 hours of development time per year as an individual, right? Maybe you're juiced up and you have a bunch more, or maybe you're like tired and you don't. But whatever, let's just say 2,000 hours. Then if you're just working on a project, that's a certain velocity you can get through things. And even if you're a 10x developer, if whether to what extent that you're comparing yourself to who, there's still an upper limit, right? And so adding in those other team members is important to be able to accelerate that velocity. So that's sort of why you're building up your team. And I think it's important to think when you should be adding people and where you should be adding people as you get to that 10 people. No project should suddenly appear with 10 people that are just like, all right, what do we do? I mean, great. And it's not happened to me. But you kind of add in people as you go. And I think as you add in people, it's a good mental exercise to say, what are the skills that those different people have and how can I leverage those different capabilities, right? So someone may be somebody who has better judgment than someone else, right? And they have a lot of the knowledge about, they have the 10,000 hours or more flight time with a bunch of different technologies. And they can say things like, let's not mess with the sign-up module right now. I know there's some debt there, but and I know that feature would be nice, but let's just hold off on doing that because I'm just nervous that could crash the system before a big demo next week, right? That's judgment, right? And so I think, having an organizational structure, which is what we're moving towards in this sort of thought process of you have somebody who's like architecting the project and helping guide and understand what are the sub pieces of that, and then having regular meetings, both with the development team about how to enact that work, but then also that person should be matrixed in or whatnot to like the product team or the clients in order to be able to really be understanding whether those broad aspects that they're pushing forward really are valuable assets for the whole project at large.
So did I hear right that one of your strategies is you want to make sure that you work with experienced people or have several experienced people on the team, as well as make sure that they have exposure or visibility into what the client's asking or demanding of you?
Yeah, wants, and I think yes, you need to not make people too insulated, but you also need to recognize that people have judgment and experience, and they can really help guide people in the right path.
Right. How do you changing topics a little bit, but on that experience and what you were talking about of maybe not delving into a particular module, but have you seen effective ways of inventorying or quantifying technical debt? How do people track their technical debt? How have you seen that happen? Have you seen good ways of doing it and reasoning about the interest rate and the term of that debt?
I have not, but I'm sure people have, right? I think it would be fascinating. And I wonder with technical debt, how, really what you're saying is treat it like a financial instrument, right? You have individual features, A through D, that you're working on, right? And you can have debt with respect to each one of those. And what's the value that you're going to gain by paying off that debt. So to what extent can you, can you gain value by holding some debt in technical debt, but then paying it off? What's all that equation look like? I don't know of tools that do that, but I think it could be an interesting subject.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've seen them either, but it seems like every project I've worked on, the topic has always come up, and there's always been expressed frustration or desire for working on it, which feeds into then some sort of negotiation around budget for feature or roadmap commitments, as well as kind of how do you trade that off against architecture or infrastructure. So have you seen good systems or processes for kind of making kind of those commitments in time and the budgeting around roadmap and features and forward-looking statements, as they would say in the financial world?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two techniques that you can do to try and get to this magical, how much is it going to cost? Everyone wants to know, how much is this sort of vague idea that I vaguely sort of mentioned to you going to cost specifically, right?
And when do I get it?
And will it radically change if I get it next week? You know what I mean? Which I think there's two ways to go about that, right? One is a kind of bottom up kind of a process, and the other is a top down process. And typically the answer is unsatisfactory to a lot of people, right?
Both ways?
Both ways. But techniques you can use to do this is to, first of all, forget about money, just look at hours, right? So that way, you're separating out, am I getting value for money? It's just how many hours will this take? And then you can talk about how you're going to source those hours in an efficient way, right? And it's a way of kind of costing up and being honest with yourself and an entrepreneur about how much this thing's going to cost, right? So one way to do that is you sort of take the project and you break it down on a spreadsheet and you list out all of these ideas, right? And the other way is to say, well, how much does this kind of thing cost? How much time does it take to do this kind of thing? Typically, how does it broadly work? If you break up a project into the individual features and you have a developer go through it and guesstimate what they think it's going to take in hours, a kind of rule of thumb is it's going to take somewhere between 2x and 4x what they optimistically think it's going to take, right? Which seems shocking, right? I mean, these are very precise thinking people. These aren't,
Yeah, the rule of thumb I had used is double and add 50%, which gets you to 3x. So I'm right in the middle.
That's it, right? You've kicked the ball right square in the goalpost. But I think it's a goalpost because you can steer the ball one way or the other, or you can miss entirely, right? So why is it 2 and why is it 4? I've often asked myself that. I think part of it is because, as an engineer, you say, I'm going to build all of these things, and you build all of this line of features, but you're not factoring in mentally, it needs a whole doubling of that to get the other features to make it usable, right? And then
people generally are very imprecise about what they mean. What estimate do I want? Do I want the 50% chance that it's going to be this? Or do I want the estimate that's 95% chance I can get it done in this amount of time? Or do I want the fully optimistic, if everything goes perfectly, then I can do it this fast? So, make sure that you've got everything lined up for me and I'm never delayed. And am I taking the chance of not having my inputs on time into consideration with my estimate? Or am I assuming I have all of the inputs 100% ready? And what does that even mean to be 100% ready for your inputs? Like, that conversation usually is never had. And so estimates mean totally different things to different people. And
and if you're in a search,
go ahead.
And if you're in a search, situation where you're getting feedback constantly, you don't even know you have an input until you hit it and you say, oh, I actually need something. I have a question that seems like the worst ones is the ones you didn't even know you were going to need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the part of it is like, the default answer is, oh, that's not a problem. He's just saying we need to spec it out more. Let's just spec it out more. And then they'll have the information they need to give me a better estimate. But the problem is speccing is actually thoroughly intertwined with building, right? So it does this sort of meaningless to say spec it is to say actually to build it. So you only really discover that as you go forward. So somewhere between two and between 2 and 4 of like what your good estimate is, you can steer it. And then you're basically, as you get towards 2, you're going to have more depth, you know, and as you get towards 4, you're going to have more, you're going to round out certain features and things like that. And then that's the kind of bottom up way of looking at it. And then there's a top down, which is to say, well, how much does these things kind of cost, right? I remember being on a Slack channel and people were talking about the app that the Democrats used to do the vote tallying. I forgot where it was recently. And the thing crashed, right? And then everyone was like, oh, it's terrible software. It all crashed. And someone dug out that it cost 60 grand to build. And someone on the Slack channel said, that seems a bit inexpensive, you know? Because, I mean, 60 grand is a big chunk of money, right? Let's not say it isn't. But if you put that in terms of development hours and look at the number of hours it takes, it's kind of like going to get you to an app which is sort of functional. But what's going to happen when you hit these weird situations like, oh, the internet connectivity is actually pretty poor in this region of the country that you wouldn't have really known about when you were building it in your, you know, richly Wi-Fi enabled development studio, or you've got all the gear, right? Or it's on these other phones and the phones don't have all of the features. That sort of stuff which robust and builds out the app. And you know, in that context, the number of hours that it would take to build a big robust app, you know, that seems like, hey, maybe that's telling you something about the kind of quality of an app you would get for 60K versus what would be more than that. You know, and although 60K seems like a lot of money, you think about startups, they don't just, you know, there's this one, another sort of aspect is, oh, it's going to take a week because, you know, my nephew, he cranked this thing out for this startup in a weekend, right? And it's like, yeah, well, maybe he cranked the first sort of version of something out in a weekend. But if that was a true statement in the world that you could build an app in a weekend, Facebook would have like 5 engineers.
Versus 5,000.
Yeah, you know, so it's like, that's another top-down approach to say, it's like, well, these startups that are like penny pinchingly trying to scrape through seem to have teams of 4 or 5 developers that they hawk, and all they seem to want is more developers. So it sort of gives you another flavor for what it's going to take in terms of hours. 5 engineers, that's 10,000 hours a year of development time, right? So you know, ongoing. And that's to round out features, to make something really nice and usable and all this kind of thing. That doesn't mean you need, you know, that much development to get something off the ground, but it starts to sort of give you an idea of where you're going to have to end up on that trajectory, which I think is a good top-down kind of way of looking at a project. And I think once you start having a conversation with a client, a partner, your own team, whoever it might be, around that kind of honest feedback on these things, you can say things like, well, you know what? I don't think you really want an app because I don't think you can afford it. So now we've taken that off the table. What can you do? Oh, well, there's some kind of framework here which you can use, which allows you to do customizing a kind of its own app, right? So you get an app, but it's sort of a customized piece of software, and it'll get you going and explore whether there's some value there to build out after the fact. And maybe it costs you only $100 a month to use a piece of software like that. Of course, if you want it to do anything that it doesn't do, you're stuffed, right? But it only costs you $100 a month, you know? So I think those are the kind of judgment calls you need to have with yourself, your partners and clients to say, what is it that we should be doing here to try and, you know, litmus test our project as we move forward.
Have you seen effective tools or systems to be able to track and kind of have shared visibility, not just your own emotion, your own thought of what your team's doing, but that everybody on the team can kind of look at the same place and kind of have a shared view of reality around, are we delivering? Is this person delivering? Am I delivering? Are you delivering? And be able to have that conversation?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, many of the tools out there have burn down charts, right? Where you're sort of saying, I'm doing these things. I'm abstracting work in terms of like featured dots to make it easy to just talk in a unit which we can get our heads around, which doesn't require everybody to be so specific on the
what is a feature dot unit? Is it a unitless unit?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a non-dimensional, potentially non-useful unit. No, I don't know. I was worried when people things are non-dimensional, so this is like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think there are tools, and I think a lot of those tools are out there and are baked into a lot of Jira and many of these other tool sets. But it still needs commitment on a team to update that, right? And one has to know that it's an additional burden on the team to do that, which may be totally the right burden, right? But it gets back to, you need to have a commitment of a number of hours of doing that project management to get a reasonable result.
On those teams that are working well and doing the project management hours, as you talk about, what are those tools? You mentioned burn down charts. Are there other tools? Are there other reports? What is your like idealized, everything's perfect, working great? What is that dashboard? What are you wanting to look at?
It depends on the number of people in a team, right? And typically the teams that I work in, I want to have a communication with the individuals that's rich enough that I really know what they're already working on. But I think it's good as a tool to have something that you can all review to make sure that you're focusing some of your attention on the project at that kind of level, right? So I think it's, you know, you could be using Kanban boards. You could use whiteboards with like stickers on them and be moving them from one, you know, stage to the next. Those are good, but then you know, sometimes.
On the last project that you worked on that you thought worked really well, what were the specifics around that project and how you tracked work and estimated it? Did you use this unitless measure, or you know, what were the tools you used there?
Basically, the kinds of projects that I've worked on, we've used things like Trello as like a good initial board to start moving us forward, and then started to use other tools to maybe create other kinds of lists of those projects. I do kind of think, you know, to me, I like to have whiteboards and use those to help basically track what's going on. I feel that if you put everything on your screen is then competing for something else it has to do, right? So I kind of value whiteboards, tracking what everybody's doing on the whiteboard, and then meetings, rather than burying it in a tool that then people don't have the time to sort of look at.
Make sure you're building the right thing, not just building it right. That's the way to wrap up. And we're really appreciative of your time today.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on here.
Well, thank you all for watching, and please subscribe by pressing the button below. Keep on learning. This has been Quantified Software.